Hello, and welcome to American History Remix. If you're a regular listener, you will notice that this is a different format. That's because this is a special Q&A episode. I am Will Schneider, and I am joined by Lyndsay Smith on Zoom. Lyndsay, how are you?
I'm doing great, Will. How are you today?
I'm doing pretty good. So I am in Oregon, and Lyndsay is somewhere. Where are you, Lyndsay?
I am somewhere in California.
Nice. So what are we doing today?
We just released Volume 1 covering topics on colonial American history through the Revolution. So we asked for questions on Instagram and Twitter. The links to those are on our website, americanhistoryremix.com. And a listener also emailed a question to americanhistoryremix@gmail.com. We really appreciate the response we received for this Q&A episode. So we plan on doing more in the future. We don't know how often we will do these kinds of special episodes, but listeners can follow us on our socials for future prompts or go ahead and email us with their questions. So what kind of questions did we get, Will?
We got a variety of questions. The majority were actually about us and about this project, wondering who we are, what we're doing, what are our goals for this project. There were also some questions, general questions about what historians do and how the craft of history works. And we got some questions related to specific topics we talked about in Volume 1, as well as a few leading into Volume 2. So that'll kind of be the order we'll address these questions in. So what we're going to do is we're just going to take turns asking each other these questions. We'll use it as a jumping off place for a conversation. Unlike other episodes, this is clearly not scripted. We are just having a conversation through Zoom.
So there may be some background noise. We'll do our best to eliminate what we can, though.
Lyndsay's trying to keep all of her cats quiet. I'm trying to keep my dog quiet. We'll see how it goes.
So how many people are on your team and what are your backgrounds? Jeff asked us this question.
Yes. Thank you for your question, Jeff. There are essentially two people on the team, two historians on the team. We have some help, obviously, with audio editing and marketing. But yeah, it's me and Lyndsay, and we met at Portland State at their in their grad program. We were both in the same cohort when we were getting master's degrees in history. So what did you study, Lyndsay?
At Portland State, I received my master's in environmental history and public history. So those were my two focus points. Mostly urban environmental history, if I would, was what I studied. And in general, how to approach and interact with the public.
Do you want to define public history? I'm not sure that's a term most people know.
Off the cuff, public history.
Is this a loaded question?
It is a loaded question, and it's a great question to ask. And I get asked it often because, I mean, when you tell somebody you have your degree in public history, they're like, what the heck does that even mean?
Right.
So off the cuff, I would say a very general definition of public history is anything relating to bringing history to the general public. So it's usually through mediums that multiple groups of people, regardless of their background, have access to. So we're talking museums, or historical sites, or
podcasts,
publications that are available to the public, like podcasts. So those are examples. But it's essentially we work. Public historians are trained exactly the same way as academic historians, and we use the same historical method, which we might talk about a little bit later on. But we employ the same methods. We use the same evidence, but we tell history in a different way, and it depends on who we're trying to reach and how much interaction we want from the public on how we tell those histories. But the main idea is that you don't have to be a professional historian to learn or interact with history. You can, public historians just kind of figure out ways to bring that more knowledge to the general public, kind of taking history out of the archives and the ivory tower and bringing it to the public. And I will probably get some I'll probably get some negative response to my response there.
Really?
But but I find,
for the record, I put Lyndsay on the spot. That wasn't in the script.
Yeah.
Our script being bullet points, not an actual script.
We don't have a script. We did kind of put some talking points in before we started our Q&A episode, but defining public history is difficult to do, and that is a good thing. I think that it gets people more interested in trying to learn on their own. You know, what does it even mean to have different types of histories? You know, like, what is an environmental historian versus an intellectual historian? What does that even mean?
Right.
Those are great questions to ask, and we hope that our audience asks that.
Right.
And yeah. So what did you study, Will?
I studied the social and intellectual history of the United States, with a few areas of focus, one of them being the American West, also race relations, music history, and religious history. The reason I had so many focuses is because I thought I was going to write my master's thesis about one thing, and then I switched, and there was a side project that became a master's thesis. So I have a number of areas that I focused in. But yeah, that's my background. People often ask what social and intellectual history is as well, and that's perhaps a little easier to define than public history. But generally, I would say it's history that focuses on culture and ideas, rather than focusing on like politics or war. Though, of course, there's overlap. There's both. But it's a matter of emphasis. And so I'm emphasizing culture. I emphasized ideas. And that's where things, interests of mine like race and music and religion come in, because they're not generally political topics. So our next question, also from Jeff. Jeff has sent in a number of questions. He says, what's the general process to make an episode, and how long does each step take? Lyndsay, how long does it take to do these?
Well, let me just start by saying that Will and I started discussing our plans to make a podcast, or, hey, do you want to make a podcast, 2 years ago.
Yeah, it's been a long time.
Okay. But through that time, we've worked out the concept. We've asked our questions like, what kind of topics are we going to cover? What is this thing? So
what's the voice of the project? All of that.
Exactly. So that took quite some time. Now, the actual process for an episode, after we've chosen the topic, is, generally speaking, we research it, we write it. The script is edited. And
repeatedly edited.
Then it's repeatedly, yes. And then it's recorded. We do a pre-edit of the audio, which we then send that to, we had a professional edit our audio and add in the music that we selected and the intro and outros that we recorded. The transcripts are then finalized so that they can be put on the website. We do have full episode transcripts on our website with citations and our sources, because we wanted to keep this project, we wanted to keep the integrity of the project by following our education, which is the historical method. And then part of that includes citation and source, keeping our sources.
Right.
So we did that. And we provide that for each episode. Then the transcripts and the audio are uploaded to the website and our podcast hosting site. Then the releases are scheduled. The podcast is released, and we look for follow-up. And there's a bunch of other stuff that goes on in there. And that's like the general process.
I would say that's a lot of steps you just listed, and that is a very condensed version.
Yes.
And
Yes, and each one of those steps, it really just depends on the episode. How much background do we have on the subject? Do we really need to start from scratch learning this topic, or do we have a history having learned it before, or researched it before? And over the course of the last 2 years, we have changed our methods, like
pretty significantly.
As far as who does what has changed quite a bit. So we have it to a very good place now, which allows us to work remotely with one another. We have, so we can be 1,000 miles apart and still be able to produce these episodes based on, we play to each other's strengths.
Yeah.
And
I guess we should say originally, if I can interrupt slightly, originally we were, the idea was that we would take turns hosting, that I would write a script and then I would like have you edit it and then I would record it. And then you would write a script or whatever order, and I would edit it and you would record it. And by having each script go through the other's editing process, there would kind of be a common voice. But you would host your episodes and I would host my episodes, and we could kind of merge our different historical interests. But we found that process didn't work. It didn't play to our strengths. And so kind of by accident, I became the host. This is why you hear my voice more. That wasn't the original plan. And originally they're going to be much shorter episodes. And so when we say it, like the podcast is 2 years old, we mean the first year, I would say, on and off, kind of sporadically working on it. We were working through, well, what do we even do? Who does what role? I mean, it kind of took probably a year before we realized, okay, you are a much, much stronger editor than I am. And I have more experience recording, so it just made sense. If I can write scripts and you can edit them and I can host them, we're playing to each other's strengths, rather than making me edit your scripts, which will make your scripts weaker because I'm not as strong as an editor. And so we realized we could kind of rearrange the roles. And that's why you all get to listen to me talk all the time and only hear Lyndsay periodically.
Right. But in a real sense, you're hearing me all the time,
exactly.
Because we really learned how to collaborate on a project.
Right.
And that's a huge part of public history too, if you want to get into it. But this is a public history project. A podcast is a public history project. And so I would say you learned quite a bit about what does being a public historian mean just by working on this project. And that comes down to, how do we write our scripts? What kind of voice are we using? And because we want it to be fun and interesting, but information packed,
right?
So in general, now we have it set up to where I take on the bulk of the research, and at least initially, and not for every episode, but for most. And Will does the writing because it's his voice that comes across, and he's a much stronger writer too than I am. But I do take pride in being able to butcher drafts
totally
to get them to a good place.
I feel like I produce a stronger first draft than you do. If we're just comparing our writing styles, but your editing is so much stronger than mine. If I write a draft and it's generally stronger than your first drafts, and then you edit it, it just creates a stronger product in general than if it was your draft being edited by me. And so, and you're the main researcher as well. So you can provide a lot of information and kind of help formulate where we want to go with the topic. And then I'll write it, and then you completely tear it apart, which is actually really fun for me because it makes the writing better. Like, you cannot hurt my feelings because I'm like, oh, this is great. This is making the project better. That's where your strength as an editor really comes through. If people could see the notes you give me back on my drafts, they're pretty brutal.
But I love doing that too. It's great having somebody who understands that I am not attacking you as a person. I
just
just
like,
want this.
Will, this is not how you use a semicolon.
Oh goodness, if I can get into capitalizations.
Oh
But
yeah.
no, but no, I think like as I'm editing my thought, I'm thinking as close to a listener as I can imagine. Somebody who has no idea about anything in this topic, can they hear this and get something out of it? Or are they asking questions that we're not answering?
And that's a great way, or I guess a great benefit of having different backgrounds in history is I can be writing about something that I have some knowledge about and realize I'm not laying a foundation or I'm coming to it with knowledge that a general audience doesn't have. And you can look at it and be like, you didn't define this term, you didn't explain this enough. And it forces me to strengthen the writing essentially, because if I'm familiar with a topic and you're not, you can catch that and vice versa.
And it's even more fun when we both approach a topic that we don't have a background in.
Which we do sometimes.
Which we do, which is great, as we both learn something. And we are always learning something, even if we do have a background in it.
I guess this leads to our next question, actually. This is a good segue. Jeff also asks, how do you decide what to talk about and what to leave out? Personal interests, perceived historical importance, novelty of the information?
I'd say it probably starts with personal interest for both of us. We're curious about a topic, or we were really excited the first time we learned about a topic.
Right.
And usually we learned about stuff as we were in our college education. So we feel like maybe these subjects were missed opportunities in public education. And we wanted to, or at least in our personal public education. And so we wanted to, when we first learned about it, we were so crazed. It was like, this is why doesn't everybody know about this? And that plays into a lot of our episodes. And also interest that we gained as we got older as historians and more involved in our own interests in general. Like, so personal interest is a big deal. So is our perceived lack of understanding among the public when it comes to certain topics, or at least certain interpretations or viewpoints. And go ahead.
So like like I said, I would echo a few things you said. For me, sometimes I read a book and I'm just blown away by the book. And I go, how did I ever not know this? How do people not know this? And I want to like tell everybody to go read these books. But often they're intimidated by a 600-page history book. And so I say, screw it. I'm going to start a podcast and I'm going to talk about these books. And then we're going to put them on the website. All right. If you're not going to go read it, we're going to talk about it and you're going to get some of the information from it. That's part, like, there's a lot of motivations for the podcast. That's one of my motivations. It's just to get people to engage with this material I've come across. That's just blown my mind. And I think it's worthwhile information that people should have.
And for me, I think that you hit you used the correct term, engaged. And for me, I really want people to ask questions about their past or the past and engage with it and not be afraid of or be intimidated by. I wouldn't say they're afraid of anything. I say for the most part, maybe intimidated by research or reading a book, or like trying to understand, like, is this book even, like, who wrote this? What were they talking about? Why? Who gives them the right to tell me this is what happened in the past? And those are really good questions to ask. And I think for me, I want people to engage in the topics and find themselves in it. If not themselves, then another interest, and they could just realize that there's a lot more going on in American history than maybe they were taught at different levels of education. And you can't remember everything you learned in school anyway, but if something excites you and gets you interested in researching more, I think that is a huge motivator for me.
Yeah, I think for me, sometimes I think about what can I do to introduce a topic and leave people with more questions, leave people wanting more, rather than presenting like, this is the totality of the information about, I don't know, the 7 Years' War or something like that, or Puritanism. Right. I'm really like,
we are not the
yeah, there's a lot to those topics. I like to like present the information, and I think what can inspire people to go want to learn more about history. Because obviously our podcast can't cover every single thing in American history. That's not our intent by any means. But if we can show people that there is more to learn, that's a great outcome for the project. And so sometimes that'll kind of motivate topics or how we'll approach topics specifically.
I would say one more thing to mention is we grew up in different regions of the United States. So we have different interests based on and different experiences with history classes and historical sites and you know what we have different questions we ask. We have different topics that we either are excited about or we avoid altogether. So it's good mixing. Yeah.
Right. When I was an undergraduate studying history, my specialty was ancient history. But I kind of grew to love U.S. history when I personally realized how much more there was to it, and realized there's so much more beyond war. I remember watching a course through Yale. Yale has open courses. They have a website with Yale open courses. You can watch the lectures of these courses and these teachers on a variety of subjects. And you can even like download the syllabus and see what they're reading. Obviously you don't get credit, but you can just kind of observe what those courses are like. And for some reason, have you done it?
To a few too.
Yeah,
I have. I really
great.
enjoy it.
I watched the Civil War one with a historian named David Blight, and it blew my mind because I thought the Civil War was so boring. I honestly don't know why I started watching it, but I for some reason did. And I think more than anything, that made me want to be an American historian because there was so much more than just battles and politics. So that's there. But those battles and politics meant so much more when I realized there's other sources you can look at. There's other voices in the American Civil War and obviously the lead up and Reconstruction afterwards as well. So I kind of became an American historian almost by accident.
Yeah, I feel like, it's a similar. I think maybe we were bored by history because we were hearing history told in a way that was fact-based, if you will. So like dates, names, and not a lot of context.
That's a good way to put it.
We were bored by history of certain types, and now we're very fascinated by the same history. And it has a lot to do with approaching it from different angles, which is something we try to do here with the podcast. So that being said, what's the long-term vision for the podcast, Will?
The long-term vision is to cover all of U.S. history up to the present in 4 volumes. So volume 1 is obviously out now. We're working on volume 2, which will go up until through the Civil War. Volume 3, we have a few ideas about, and then volume 4 is pretty vague at this point. We have some topic ideas, but obviously the further out they are, the less planned they are. But we're in the process of writing and researching volume 2. But yeah, our goal is to go all the way through U.S. history and kind of continue the same process of taking familiar stories and adjusting our perspective, or taking things that are generally overlooked and trying to shine some light on them. Is there anything you would add to that? That one's a little more straightforward.
No, that's a very straightforward question. we might try special episodes. If we get enough listenership, we might be able to expand into like Patreon type situation, but we're not looking, that's way in the future. And what we would like to do is always constantly continue to develop the podcast. So you'll hear, it'll change, it'll get better. We hope we're going to bring, we hope to even expand into bringing other historians in, at least for like specific topics. There are things we have a lot of ideas and a lot of ambitions, and we understand how lofty they are in a lot of ways, but in others, like how practically like we can get there. And so we do appreciate our regular listeners and those who have subscribed to us, because that gives us more like opportunity to reach larger audiences. So, and like following us on social media and stuff like that really helps out a lot too. So that will help us grow the podcast just for you being here. So we appreciate that. And we have lots more in store for you guys. So maybe it's a little bit of time between our volumes, but we don't want to leave you guys hanging. We'll give you something in between volumes as well.
Like this.
Like this.
The next question: how do you go about leaving your personal biases out of how you present information? That's a big question.
It's a big question. And, you know, it's so wonderful that Jeff asked that question as well. That's a question that we explore in detail as history students. We have
books and courses written on this subject.
Because it's very important that we understand that the historian plays a role in the history that they tell. We all have our own backgrounds and perspectives and our own biases, and we just have to be honest with ourselves and with our listeners or readers, if we're writing, that we have our limitations and we have our biases. So usually a historian will put that in their thesis statement or in their introduction to their book or something like that. What they'll do is they will explain, you know, what their limits were or what kind of evidence they used, what kind of evidence they couldn't get a hold of.
Or saying what they're choosing not to cover because of it's out of their scope, or they're choosing to focus on a specific topic because other historians haven't spoken on it. Which all reflects their perspective. So like historians will do essentially two things. One is they will admit their perspective. And this is a bit weird, I think, for non-historians to realize. I think non-historians generally will think of history as simply a body of information, and historians are just people who have mastered that material. And don't recognize that historians have to interpret the material because there's so much. No history can cover everything. There's always new voices to uncover. These are things I've talked about in specific episodes. So historians will admit their perspective, but they will also try to mitigate that by the historical method of citing sources, footnotes of how they engage with arguments with other historians. And a good historian will lay all of this out in the intro of their work, whether that's an article or a book. So history isn't a science. It borrows from science in the sense that there's a method, there's a peer review process, but it is not definitive the way a science can be.
Yeah, and I think the main thing there is in the word interpretation. So whenever you're reading or listening to a history, understand that it is an interpretation of the past based on evidence, and hopefully a lot of it. So with us, we're not presenting you with our own original new research. We're presenting you with research that we found very interesting, and we happen to agree with them. Or if we don't, we'd let you know. No. But so far, we've, at least on the main points, we've agreed enough to bring that to you.
I guess I would caveat that a little bit, because
okay.
when we're, let's say there's 1, 2, or 3 really important books that I love on a subject and we want to bring it together. I feel like in some ways we're synthesizing that and we're presenting it to an audience. And so I'll at least take an argument from one author that I really like and another argument from another author I really like, even though they might disagree on different subjects, or clash with each other. It's really interesting when you start reading history and historians will critique other historians' interpretation. You'll see that when you really dig into the material, you'll see that pretty often. And so in a sense, our voices do come out and our perspective does come out because we're synthesizing it, and we have to make cuts. We have to make hard choices about what can we cover in this episode? What can't we cover in this episode? There are things sometimes we want to cover that we simply can't because of time restraints, or we think will overwhelm the audience. So our perspective certainly does come through in that. I think one thing to address, or I guess another thing to address, is that our goal is always to understand the past, not necessarily to judge it, with a few exceptions. Obviously, when I talk about slavery in the Atlantic trade episode, my perspective that slavery is bad comes through. That's my bias that I stand by. Obviously, other people in history have not had that bias. But so there is a sense in which I'm critiquing the past or saying this was morally wrong. But there are other cases where, say, Puritanism, for example, I was trying to make no effort to judge the Puritans, celebrate or condemn them. It was merely, let's understand who they were. And I think more often we try to lean there, but occasionally we come across things like slavery, or I'm currently researching Cherokee removal. Like, I can't, those are abhorrent like that. And I'm not going to hide that I think they're abhorrent.
And I think it's very obvious in our episodes when it is us speaking to you versus us
hopefully
speaking
that comes through
other historians, but so that's an example of us, like, you're going to hear our bias and you're going to hear our perspective, especially when we're trying to like keep it in the topic and the episode interesting and rolling. And if Will's talking about the Packers, that has nothing, that wasn't in the book. That's
true.
But anyway, I think we hold ourselves accountable, and a good historian holds themselves accountable.
So I guess to kind of summarize that is there isn't one specific answer. It's a little bit case by case, and historians will have different perspectives on this. And that's, I think, a little surprising to the general audience. If that's not surprising to you, reach out to us on Instagram and Twitter and our email and let us know what you think historians do.
But be nice.
Yeah, be nice. If someone writes in with a legitimate question or a legitimate critique that's civil, we're happy to engage with people who disagree. If people write in and they're just angry, vehement, like social media garbage, I don't have the energy to engage with it. But
which so far we haven't had that, so we appreciate that. Our listeners are very kind.
I guess that leads to our next question.
What are the key differences between how a historian views historical events when compared to an average civilian? Civilian in
quotations. As the listener wrote it. So I guess this is a very personal question, actually, because I think different historians will have it differently. And so Lyndsay and I, we might have different perspectives on this. I don't know. Again, we didn't script this.
No, it's unscripted.
So for me, whenever I hear about an event recently a recent event, an event in the past, or some sort of current event that comes with a lot of baggage, I'm always thinking about the broader trends that those things exist within. Sometimes we can focus on little events and we can look or little moments in history or certain figures and not realize they're part of a much bigger story. Jamestown is probably the best example, our episode on that. And so whenever I come across some sort of event, I'm trying to place it in its historical context, whether that's understanding how people thought at the time or what was going on with politics or where the nation was at or whatever.
I'd say, yes, we definitely ask what were the circumstances surrounding the events and what were the circumstances surrounding those reporting on the events.
That's a great point.
So
when was the source written? Were they eyewitnesses?
Yeah.
Were they eyewitnesses, but it was written 20 years later? What was the perspective of the person writing down the narrative that we now have? That's one of a big thing, like evaluating the source and not taking it as infallible.
Right, because if you are talking about European colonization and you're reading a source written at the time, so we call it a primary source, from a person who is trying to get people to move to the Americas, he's going to be trying to sell a product to, and so he's going to describe the land in a way that's going to entice people to move there. So that's what we're talking about. Like what is, like, where are we getting this report from? Even if it's a news report or if it's reading a document from 300 years ago,
or even like reading,
who wrote it?
Yeah, reading newspaper articles. I had to read a ton of newspaper articles for my my master's thesis, and I had to realize that they're trying to sell newspapers. That doesn't necessarily mean what they're doing is exaggerating or completely inaccurate, but it's a fact to consider. And we have to make judgments on their accuracy.
Right. And a lot of times it's reading between the lines. So the event is much more significant within its context.
So from now, we'll move on to some more specific questions about some of the material we covered. There's one listener wrote in with several questions for a whole bunch of food for thought. I'll just read through them all, and then, Lyndsay, you can start unpacking it. What did Europeans think about tobacco once they understood what it meant to Native Americans? How did Europeans pick up the habit after first being astonished by it? And how did they learn to cultivate and process it? Did some natives profit from the industry of the production of tobacco? And how did the globalization of tobacco change its place within Native American cultures? These are excellent questions. There's a whole lot there. So this is mostly referencing, mostly about our Atlantic trade episode 4, though this touches on a bit about the colonial environment in episode 2 as well, which I view episodes 2 and 4 as thematically linked.
Yes.
And so, Lyndsay, why don't you unpack that for us?
Okay, so this listener had quite a few questions related to tobacco, and we found them all fascinating, and we really appreciate the response. This is exactly part of our goals as presenting this podcast, is to create questions like this. And in response, I read an article found in the journal Environmental History. It's from October of 2004. Historian Peter C. Mancall, Tales Tobacco Told in 16th Century Europe. And in that article, he answers quite a few of these questions. And so kind of to summarize, Mancall referenced books printed in the 16th and early 17th centuries to show what Europeans thought about tobacco and how it eventually became a global commodity. Essentially, Europeans were fascinated about all things concerning the Western Hemisphere. European explorers, travelers, and naturalists wrote extensively about the New World and its fascinating peoples, plants, and animals. Okay, the New World's potential for creating and driving wealth was also immediately acknowledged across Europe. Unlike other commodities like potatoes, corn, and beaver pelts, tobacco came with cultural baggage. 16th and 17th century writers were conflicted by what to think about tobacco and whether Europeans should have anything to do with it. As far as the accounts show, Europeans learned about tobacco from observing Native Americans. Mancall doesn't really answer the question of whether or how natives taught Europeans about their uses, cultivation, and processing of tobacco, but Europeans most certainly wrote about and drew pictures of the plant and its uses, cultivation, and so on. Since Europeans learned a great deal from natives in other areas, I'm going to say it's safe to presume that at least some native groups shared information on tobacco with some Europeans. Then they shared that information with other Europeans and so forth. As we noted in many of our episodes in Volume 1, some European peoples were more interested in learning from and interacting with native peoples than others.
I think that's a really important point to point out, is that Native Americans were no more a unified group than Europeans were. And once first contact happened, the relationship wasn't necessarily stable. In fact, there was a ton of dynamic change in the relationship between different Native communities with different European communities over time. So that's one of the really important things to at least acknowledge with this question, is there is perhaps not one answer. There's probably 100 different answers for how different communities interacted with the plant and then interacted with Europeans who were interested in the plant.
Exactly. Interpretations of tobacco developed over time, going from being a curious substance that the natives always seemed to have with them, usually in a pouch around their necks, or up to a key ingredient in savage quotation or devilish quotation practices, to being a plant with many civilized quotation uses. And that's important because this is how it was described.
Those are direct quotes. That's not us.
Right. And you see this over and over again in printed works. And in order for tobacco to cross the cultural divide, as Mancall argues, Europeans had to make it their own, divorce it from the stigma of being used in Native American spiritual practices, and place it within European cultural contexts. So printed books, he argues, is how Europeans were able to make tobacco their own in a process anthropologists call commodity indigenization or commodity fetishism. Essentially, Europeans had to create an image of tobacco that was acceptable, and to do that, as this historian argues, merchants and publishers printed books that told people about the positives of tobacco and how great it is. And these works often reached people before the plant itself did. So it's kind of like a back and forth. So Europeans observed Native Americans using tobacco to treat illnesses and skin irritations. They chewed or smoked the leaves and experienced an increase in energy or a calmness if they consumed a lot of it. And they used tobacco in healing rituals and as gifts to spirits. That's generally speaking. And Europeans also observed natives, quote, drinking smoke in great quantities to interact with spirits, receiving revelations and hallucinations. Now, it's very possible that Europeans lumped multiple plants that the Native Americans used in rituals under the name tobacco, but at the very least, they witnessed many uses and applications for the plant. The attachment to native rituals caused many Europeans to fear and hate tobacco, but eventually, enough merchants and other Europeans claimed that tobacco did have medicinal applications and could stimulate a tired person and could sustain a hungry person for some time, and was in general a pleasurable substance, that it became a global commodity. But people always objected to it, either on the basis of its origins or the soot and smell from the smoke, or how it affected a person's body or behavior. King James I hated the stuff. He wrote quite extensively on how much he hated it. And from the very beginning through to today, people found reasons why tobacco was unhealthy for both those who consumed it and those who received the secondhand smoke. So even in the 16th century, people acknowledged secondhand smoke, which is kind of interesting. Still, as history showed, tobacco proved to be a resilient crop. A combination of market forces and physiological effects, that being addiction, helped it along. So, very interesting, very interesting. And to answer what roles the natives played in the North American or global tobacco economy, and whether commodifying tobacco changed its place in native cultures, would take more research, and I believe would be very interesting. We will recommend some sources on our website, and if the topic gets enough interest, maybe we can do a special episode in the future, or at least present a special transcript. But yeah, so it's really fascinating, and I would like to hear more thoughts on that if there are any. And thank you to our listener for that question. Do you have anything to add, Will?
No, I guess the other thing to consider there is that tobacco is addictive. And so once Europeans would try it for possibly medicinal reasons, they would want to keep trying it and so on. And so I think that's the other thing to consider, is unlike potatoes or beaver pelts or whatever else, tobacco is addictive. All right, should we go to the next question?
Yes. Okay, Will. Brian wants to know, do you subscribe to the theory that Jordan Love should get MVP votes for being the chip on Aaron Rodgers' shoulder that he needed to prove to the Packers and the league that he's not giving up being QB1?
This is a fantastic question, Brian. I'm glad you brought this up. I'm glad that people actually wrote in with Packer questions. Short answer, I guess I should give some background. Aaron Rodgers is the starting quarterback of the Packers. He's been the starting quarterback for like 13 years now or so. He has won a Super Bowl. He's won a Super Bowl MVP, as well as 2 league MVPs. He has the highest passer rating of any quarterback in NFL history for his career. In this offseason, the Packers drafted his heir apparent, essentially, Jordan Love, in the first round. And the idea is he'll sit behind Rodgers for a few years and learn from Rodgers, and then the Packers will move on. This is exactly what happened when Rodgers was drafted. He was drafted when the Packers had Brett Favre, and he sat behind Brett Favre for 3 years before becoming the starting quarterback. So do I subscribe to the theory that drafting Jordan Love has made Rodgers play better? I mean, maybe a tiny bit, but no, I don't. The GM has invested in the defense in the last 2 years, the O-line and running backs, to take the pressure off of Rodgers, which is all helping the offense function better. And also, I would say that the second-year offense with head coach Matt LaFleur is also much better than the first-year offense was last year. So what you're really seeing is Aaron Rodgers and Matt LaFleur totally in sync. Week 6 notwithstanding, I don't want to talk about the Tampa Bay game, which is the most recent game as we record this. No one write in talking about the Tampa Bay game. I don't want to talk about it. But overall, no, Rodgers is running LaFleur's offense, and LaFleur's offense is helping Rodgers, and those two in sync is awesome. Rodgers running LaFleur's offense is just a thing of beauty. It's amazing. I would also say I don't care about the MVP awards, sort of. Rodgers has 2. It'd be great if he got another one before he retires, but ultimately I don't care. I want a Lombardi trophy. I want to bring back the Lombardi trophy to Titletown, Green Bay. That's really what I care about. Though it would be cool if the Packers had 2 quarterbacks who won 3 MVPs, with Brett Favre winning 3 in the 90s and then Rodgers winning 3 in his career. That'd be amazing to have 2 quarterbacks in a row doing that. So that's my that's my long answer to Brian's question about the Packers. Now we're going to move on to another question.
Thank you.
I don't know if anyone else is interested, but Brian wrote in, so I'm going to answer it.
The listener asked, and the listener was answered.
You talked about tobacco for like 25 minutes. I take 3 minutes.
That's relevant. That's relevant.
They're both questions we got from fans.
Okay.
Brian has a second question. He said, would you agree that prior to the Revolutionary War, that the economic modalities of the southern colonies could most aptly be characterized as agrarian pre-capitalist? Lyndsay, what are your thoughts?
Well, this is a quote from Good Will Hunting.
This is a direct quote from Good Will Hunting.
Yes. And in fact, we were going to use a quote from this scene in our Internal Revolution episode, and we had to cut it due to time constraints. But it was relevant since it was speaking on the historian Gordon Wood, who is one of the historians we referenced quite a bit for that episode. But I'm going to let you answer the question, Will.
So, yeah, unfortunately, we had the quote in there, and we referenced the scene and referenced Gordon Wood, the scene in the bar when they're arguing about history. But that episode was just too long, and in the final edit, we had to take a whole bunch out to try to make it a manageable size. But I'm sad we lost that. But essentially, to answer the actual question here of what did the economy of the U.S. look like prior to the war, was it mostly an agrarian society, or was it participating in this capitalist mercantile system of Atlantic trade we talked about in episode 4? And I would actually say, yes, it was mostly agrarian. Prior to the war, or could really just say for the whole 1700s, it was much easier for colonists to interact with the Atlantic colony or Atlantic trade than to interact with each other. Trade within the colonies was very limited because the transportation system was very, very weak at the time. And so you kind of had a bunch of separate economies, not one unified market economy for the whole United States. That doesn't really develop until the early 19th century, after the War of 1812. We call this the market revolution, is when these manufactories start developing, when there's this interconnected system of trade throughout the United States. But like all revolutions, it has its antecedents. There are roots of it much earlier, but it didn't really come into its own until the market revolution. And this is actually something we're talking about in volume 2. So the caveat I would give to all of this is something I'm currently researching and writing about. And so my opinion might change as I continue reading and writing on this subject. But what's really interesting is this is kind of a debate the founding fathers had after the government was established, was what kind of nation are we going to be? Are we going to be a rural, agrarian, kind of independent farmer nation, which is kind of what Thomas Jefferson imagined? Are we going to be a more mercantile nation with a large national banking system like Alexander Hamilton wanted? or that John Adams wanted. And so there's actually this big debate going on among the founders and among really the first decade or two of the nation. And that we're actually going to trace that debate in episode 1 of volume 2. So this question actually leads into some of the things we're going to be talking about. The founding fathers having very different visions of what the nation should be. And so we're hopefully going to explore these controversies much more in the future. Is there anything you would add to that, Lyndsay?
No, well, we really expand on, a lot happens in the antebellum period that I feel is definitely glossed over in a lot of American history courses. And I think that we are going to surprise our listeners quite a bit with the America that existed in antebellum period. That means pre-Civil War is a lot different than kind of the images that are left behind, or at least are more popular. So like the country really becomes its own in a way. It's still a young country, but so politics, economy changes, but the size
of the nation changes dramatically, both geographic and
the
population.
The society, what does that look like? What is the American culture? A lot of things change. So we do spend quite some time just talking about those changes, like
of an agrarian society to a more market economy, a almost completely rural society to at least a bit more urbanization, small by modern standards, but radical change for the people who are living through it.
Right. And we detail experiences of urbanization in New York City, for example. So really exciting stuff, and stuff that didn't come to my attention until after high school. So it's really nice.
This is definitely a case of reading some books and just being blown away by how much was going on in this era that I originally thought was boring purely out of ignorance. I just I don't know, there was a revolution, then nothing really happened, and then there's slavery and a war, like a civil war. But there is so much happening in this era in terms of politics. I already mentioned the size and the population of the nation. There's technology, a completely new economy, a new way of working, a new type of workforce, a national culture for the first time. There's improvements in transportation and communication, which is a big theme we're going to cover, which allow books and authors to make a living from those books, and magazines and newspapers pop up, and popular songs. There's the development of a popular American culture, as well as a number of things that we generally associate with later eras in American history actually have their roots in the antebellum era. Some of the things that come to fore in the progressive era, the early 1900s, all have their roots from this time period, and some weird connections between the 1960s and the 1840s. There's weird parallels there that I think that'll surprise some people. But it surprised me. And so
gender roles.
Gender roles are changed in this time period. And so it's a fun era. I'm actually really excited for volume 2, just because I'm having a good time researching and writing, and I think we have some fun stuff in store. So is there anything else you want to say about volume 2?
No, that pretty much sums it up. Just be ready for it. It's going to be a little bit before we get it out, because it does take some time to put these things together, but we are working diligently.
We're going for quality over quantity and speedy episodes. So we'll have it out in 2021. I think we're shooting for the spring, but we don't want to rush episodes and do a poor job. And some of these things just take time.
Again, follow us on Instagram and Twitter, and you will be the first to know when an episode's coming out. And if you subscribe to us on any of the streaming platforms, usually when a new episode comes up, you get notified. So make sure you're subscribed.
We might do another Q&A episode or two, maybe before.
If we get good responses, for sure.
Yeah. So if anyone else has questions on these topics, on history in general, on the Green Bay Packers,
no,
Volume 1 or 2,
Will has answered his one question about the Green Bay Packers that he's allowed to answer for Volume 1, but
I'm going to let the fans speak. If listeners want to know, I'm going to talk about it. But yeah, if people have questions, please write in. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter, American History Remix. Write into our email account, AmericanHistoryRemix@gmail.com. Check out our website. There are all sorts of books that we recommend people read. You can read the scripts and look at the sources there. There's a lot to keep people engaged until Volume 2.
On our website, you can also learn a little bit more about us. We do have a little bio page there, which includes our marketing consultant, Allie Gavette. So,
hi, Allie.
Hey, Allie.
She's probably listening. So that is it for our first Q&A episode. Thank you guys for listening. Lyndsay, anything you want to say to the audience before we're done?
Just thank you for being so supportive while we put the podcast together, and so kind about our Volume 1 releases. And please continue to listen, subscribe, rate, review, and check us out on social media if that's what you're into.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.